In this video, we're going to be focusing on creating some UI for web, and this particular use case is for a component that's commonly called a pop-up or an overlay. Commonly see on websites that are trying to attract attention from you, whether they're requesting your email for sign up or getting you to subscribe to something. This is just kind of one of those patterns that is in play. I'm not in love with the pattern myself, being a web designer, because it's impending on a user, but it does seem to work based on a bunch of data that's backed up the fact that you would use these in production on a website. So the goal of this is just to kind of give a feel for Affinity Designer and get used to using some constraints and just generally make something with this app. So it features a subscribe form that is a name and a credit card. So this is maybe something that if you did click actual subscribe on a site to maybe get a service of some sort, this could be that kind of pop-up that happens in the experience. So let's recreate this. And the idea behind it is that it's a responsive design. So you have to think in terms of making this work on all devices. So over here on the right, I have an iPhone with, as an example, even though there's tons of devices out there, the idea is to support as many as possible. So this is assuming a lot is going to happen within this width. This is like the latest iPhone X width and height. So there is actually an artboard by default, a template that you can use in Affinity Designer, the latest version, that allows you to just create this willy-nilly. So we'll use that to recreate this design in a responsive manner, as you see here. As you see, the design does change when it gets down to that level, and that's intended, and that's all for better user experience. You really want to make it easy for anyone coming from any device to do what they need to do on a website. So let's get going. There's a lot of theory behind the design of web and all of its components and patterns. So this one in particular, it's commonly referred to as kind of a dark pattern, simply because it gets shoved into users' faces without them expressing consent for it. So without further ado, I'll quit yapping and we'll get started. So let's go ahead and first create our new document that will feature two artboards. So I'll go and hit Command N or File New from the menu, and you can go up to Templates and go to Web for the type, and I'll just set a basic 1440 by 900, so 16 by 10 ratio for our actual desktop artboard on the left here. I do want to tick this box called Create Artboard, and from there we should be set. After we create this, we'll create the iPhone artboard. So while we're at it, I'll bring back my tool palette and rename this to desktop. And let's see, I'm going to get rid of this. We'll go back to color. From that previous project, I did create a few things that we might use in this to speed up the process, just for the sake of usability and easiness. I did create a color palette just to kind of define what we did use over here. So I'm going to export that to my desktop for now. And this is a document color palette. So you can create a system, an application, and a document. Document is relative to the document only. You won't see it if you create a new document and look for that same color palette in it. So that's important. Just import that real quick. I saved it to my desktop there. So we'll go back to the same color palette panel and import as document palette. And we'll just grab that same file. And we should have it. Great. So we can save this down. I'll save it just to the desktop again as, what did I call the first one? Responsive pop-up overlay. So I will say that this component gets quite a few different names based on the market. I've heard it called a modal. I've heard it called a dialog box. I've heard it called a pop-up. Whatever you prefer, feel free to refer to it as that. I'm kind of struggling for a name, but I typically refer to them in my day job as a modal. Just a side thought there. Let's go ahead and create the iPhone document now, or the artboard. So you create the artboard by clicking the artboard tool. And before you do anything over here, you can drag and create one, but we don't want to do that. We want a template to start from. So I'm going to go to document, or this artboard selector size, and just go to iPhone X. If you have the latest version of Designer, you should see this template. If you don't, you'd probably see these, and that's okay. You can use those too, but this one's going to be a little bit longer. Select that size, hit this button, insert artboard, and it should just append it to your document. Great. So we have our canvases set up essentially at this point. So I did create a gradient for the backgrounds for these, and what we're going to use is that. So we'll start by grabbing that and just setting the artboards themselves to this gradient. The problem so far with the gradient is that it doesn't remember the exact pitch that you've set it at, so it sets this default from left to right. So I actually want to go from the bottom left corner to the right top corner for the lighter shade. It's subtly different. So the darker shade will be in the bottom left, and the lighter shade will be in the bottom right, or top right. So that sets the premise of our background. That kind of gives it some just subtle, overlay experience. So what we need next is this bounding container for the overlay on the desktop. I'm going to focus on the desktop first and then go down to the mobile version. So this one in particular is, let's see what size we set it at. 1000 by 588. So the width is more important probably than the height. The height can vary depending on whatever you want to design for. 1000 pixels on the web is pretty wide. It's on a typical laptop, it's about 3/4 of your screen maybe, and on an iPhone or something like that, it would definitely take up a lot of space. So we want to actually condense that width when we're down to mobile size, which we'll get into. So just draw a basic rectangle for now, and we'll go ahead and make those perfect dimensions to try to match our original design. So I'll make that 1000, and the bottom was, I think, 588. If you don't already have these selected, go ahead and select each of these. Snapping, I pretty much have everything selected in this panel. Snapping's a lifesaver in Affinity Designer. It really helps you move things about and nudge things in a specific way that makes them just more easier and scalable. We don't want half pixels at any point, or at least where we can control it, because that doesn't translate to code necessarily. So another thing I like to set when I'm working in pixels and perfect pixels is how much a typical nudge is. If you go to your preferences and go to tools, there's a modifier nudge distance, and you can control that. That's just basically when you hit any arrow key on your keyboard and the item moves, this is how far that moves. And I like to set mine at 8. It's just kind of a golden ratio space that's worked best for me. You can use whatever format you prefer there. I just think that that one's going to be the best case for us. I'm going to make this rectangle have a bit of corner radius. So if you go up to the contextual menu here, you can select absolute size. I like to think in pixels. If you don't prefer that, you can unselect it and use percentages. I think pixels are just more better for web. So what I want to do is make this one about 6 pixels in radius on each corner. And that's very subtle, but it is enough to kind of get the idea across. So let's save that down. And this is centered at this point. You can use your smart guides. If you have these all selected, your smart guide should show. If you don't see them, you can go ahead and show your rulers, and they should appear after that. Without the rulers shown, your experience might look like this. Oops, Command R. If you hit Command R on a Mac, it will hide and show the rulers. And rulers are nice because you can pull out guides when you need them from the ruler itself. Those are custom, but you can always add your own from the guides manager as well if you need an actual perfect pixel guide. So maybe we'll add just center and center for each horizontal radius and vertical radius. And maybe we'll do the same on this one just while we're at it. So I'll save this down, and right now what I need next is just to start kind of getting our content aligned. We have in our original design, we have this title tag and then basically some form elements. Okay, so next let's add this title to our document, and I'm gonna grab this as from the layers and get the actual text content from it. So I'll just kind of click my way through there to finally get to it. and then we'll enter it into this mode. Right now we have an art text tool, and I actually want to have a frame text. So if you hit T once, you'll get this cursor preview, and if you hit T twice, you get the frame text. So make sure you do that. It'll help when the text wraps to just, make it actually wrap to the way we prefer, as opposed to just stretching, which is what the art text tool would do. Great. So with this done, we have essentially the font that we're using, which is Zilla Slab from Google. I definitely link to this in the notes below in the description. So look for that if you want to download that. But aside from that, we'll use one more font that will be for the buttons, which is a fun, I think it's called Montserrat or something like that. I'm probably butchering the name, but we'll get into that, as well as some icons, which we'll source here in a second. Just align this the best I see fit. It looks like this one's kind of off center in the sense of things. So the guide, maybe I'll add a guide back in here just to see where it is relative to our original design. There's one, there's the middle. That was pretty close. Okay, so it overlaps the middle just a tad, so we'll actually want it to be about like that. And then to the left, we'll have that photo area. We do need to draw another shape to mask to it, because I do want to use constraints in this design. And if you haven't checked out the constraints, it's a nice way to scale things without having to always edit them later. So for our form elements, for example, I could just drag everything left or right, and they'll scale proportionally and not stretch the text or whatever is within the middle. So I could show you that right now, really. So if we grab that form, say this form element, this text field, I wanted to just stretch really wide. It's doing so, but you notice this actual label of the field isn't skewing or anything. So that's constraints at work. And that's beautiful in my mind. So all of these things I actually set constraints on just to show by example. It's not a fail-safe solution to responsive design, but it does help dramatically with things that do scale, like almost always, like menus, buttons, form elements, stuff like that. It really saves some time when you're designing. So with that said, we'll set up that as we go. But from here, I want to actually move forward and get some of these components built. So let's go first get that image. Okay, so I have the image on my desktop. I'm going to go ahead and grab it. First, I'm going to create a new shape, though, that is about this far over on our... It's on top of the other shape we created. And what I want to do is match the one below it, simply because I want to mask that photo to this shape, but not have it actually mask to the main modal, and that's simply so I can scale things a little better. It's just kind of a preference at that point, so you can do whatever you prefer. If you'd rather just crop it to that modal container, that's quite all right. Absolute sizes. If you uncheck single radius, you can adjust each corner independently, which is awesome. First, I'm going to set 6 pixels for each and then do that, just to kind of save myself some time. I don't want the right sides of this shape to have any radius, so I'm going to actually turn those off to none. Remaining 2 on the left I do want, so I'm going to grab that, and so far so good there. So what we want to do is place that image in. So go to File, Place, and we've got it right here. And I'm assuming this app's like a produce, maybe produce subscription kind of app, something like that. It seems subscription models for everything are all too common these days, so that's just kind of the idea there. That went pretty fast, but basically what I did is place that image, and based on that shape we drew, we dragged that image just below it. And I'll do it again just to show by example. If you have that first shape, and to mask to it but not destruct the photo, you want to just drag just below it. You'll see a little highlight appear, but you want it to be above that. So go down and then drop it in. It'll be kind of nested. So this is a nested mask, and in essence you can still control that shape but not affect the photo behind it, but you can still move the photo, which is great. So if I want to adjust the crop, I still have that shape to always crop it to. Okay, so if I want to adjust this, you'll notice that photo stretches. If you don't want that to stretch, you can lock the children with this feature right here, and all too conveniently, it won't move when you do that. So it's up to you, based on if you're doing a lot of cropping and need that kind of feature. We need to add some form elements next, and I'll go ahead and do that now. We will go ahead and grab that. I'll probably make just a square for these, and I know already that about 40 pixels is about a decent height for a form element on the web. That just comes from someone who's coded websites and stuff before. If you've never done that, you might reference other websites and just, measure, take screenshots and measure what things are. That doesn't have to be any specific height. It's just kind of a basic pattern that you see a lot, that form fields have a specific height and they're all about the same height on each given website. So that's just something to take into account if you're new to web design. So what I want to do for each of these is have a fill of white and a stroke. So the stroke is going to be about a pixel or a point in this case. And actually we probably want to go about a half point. So if you enter 0.5, you can still get away with that. And what I want to do is have the stroke aligned to the inside. So I'm going to click this box here. The rest you can leave alone, essentially, and you should be all set. That's going to create the actual form field, but we still need to style it. So I do want to have some radius on these corners as well. So I'll hit rounded. It gives 10 pixels by default. I'm going to get that just to 3. It's just a very subtle border radius. So there we go. The stroke itself is black. I actually want it to be kind of a grayish color, not so prominent. So maybe like a 777 in the hex code value. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's always going to be 6 numbers in there. So we hit enter and good to go. And that's actually a little dark for me still, so I might come back on that and go with 9. And what we can do to kind of amp this up a little bit is add some inner shadow, and it kind of gives it an embossed look when you input into the field. So we want it to just not seem so super flat, but still be a container for your cursor when you go to click in to enter text content. So we can increase the radius here. We'll maybe just use normal on the blend mode. And offset, looks like our angles from the bottom, we actually want it from the top there. So there we go. Let's see how that looks. And it's a little dark. Very, very subtle is what we're going for in this case. Probably just come back the opacity, offset, come up a little bit, the radius back a bit. Just do what you think looks the best in this case. The hardest thing for forms is designing for every which state that they are used in. So there's states of when a form isn't clicked on, or a form element, I should say, when it is clicked on, when it's clicked out of, like all these things can change in the style. So it's a lot to think about. We're just going to worry about the static state of the form at this point. So don't fear if that's a little over your head. So what we're going to do is run with that design. It's probably a little different on our original design. It looks like our stroke around the edges is a little lighter, and I actually might even go that route and make it even lighter. So I'm going to go D60s to get to that color. So we have that part figured out. A great way to scale this style and not have to do that every time you create one, which we're going to create quite a few more fields if you saw the original, is to create a style itself in Affinity Designer. So I'm going to create a new category in the styles panel. If you don't see this open in your document, you can go to View, Studio, and Styles and click that. It'll give you some defaults which have their own use case when you need them. I like to create my own per document just to have things that I repeat, share the same styles, so I don't have to always spend a lot of time configuring things. So you can create a new one by adding a style category and then renaming it to whatever you prefer. So I'll just call this overlay styles, something like that, just to give you context, because you can create a ton of these. Or control click on a Mac or right click on PC and go and look for create style in that menu. So we'll go ahead and do that, and it creates one for you. It just calls it style one, but you can right click that one and rename it as well. So I'll hit rename and just call this form input. Great. So now any other form I create, I can just go ahead and click that style and it'll apply the same styles to it. So that's awesome. From here, I do want to create a label for our form field. So I'm first going to call this one name. And for the form fields themselves, I'm just using a basic system font. So you can use like Arial or Helvetica in this case. We'll use, say, Helvetica on a Mac. Comes pretty standard. If you're on a PC, Arial is a great replacement for Helvetica if you want to go that route. I commonly prefer to use not 100% black on any text on pretty much any design. You don't need 100% black. Against white, it's very high in contrast and it's just not necessary. You don't want to go too light though, so that's something to take into account for people who have vision problems. Select that text and we'll go to fill, and I'll actually go to this one here in the swatches and double click it. The way you can work with this, you can enter the hex code you want, and since I work with the web a lot, I already know kind of the general color code I'll use. So I typically use 3333 across, or even 4s there if you want just a little less contrast. And you won't notice a big change there, but it does make a difference for your eyes and other people's eyes who, look and read screens all day. It's just kind of less tension on those when that does happen. So to give ourselves some guidance here, we might make some just makeshift guides to keep some margins on this frame, so we kind of have a guide to go against so they look consistent across the whole design. So on our first design, it actually wasn't quite 100% centered, which was my fault there, but what we can do is just kind of mimic that style and continue forward. So we have our form for our name, and that's basically the hard work done for the first element. So let's just call this F name. And to duplicate a layer, you can hit Command J and it should go ahead and do that. So below that, we had the card number. And I actually set this text to bold, but I think I like it not bold. So we'll run with that. This field is going to be a little less in width, and we'll have card number as the label. We'll just abbreviate with that hash. And then next to it was the expiration date, which is just a month year entry. So we'll Option Shift click to duplicate as you drag. And here's where constraints come in handy, and I'll show you why I'm using constraints. If you were to scale this down, you see that text skews, and that's kind of a nuisance. You'd have to click into that group, resize that form and element, and then basically regroup it, rename it, all those things. To save time, we could have made these all constraint groups. So what I'll do is backtrack, and I'll just start from each and make each a constraint group. You can group things obviously by the relation, but the main thing you want to think about is the thing that you want to constrain to something is what you want to deal with in this case. So in the constraints view, you're given this UI to work with, and it's a little unclear at first what everything does, but what it starts to make sense as you go along. And what these arrows indicate is the fact that this thing itself can scale both vertically and horizontally at this point if you just dragged it. It's relative to the group though, so it needs a parent, and then within each parent is the child. So to make this probably make a lot more sense, I'll actually deselect these arrows on the name label, but I'll leave the one for the form element or the input alone because I want it to be able to resize. So from there, this group gets a new label called constraints group, and the beautiful thing there is that this can now shift and left align and do its thing. What we want to do though is make sure this name label always stays affixed to the left and doesn't move. So if we enter that mode again, select the name text and then hit this left icon here, left line that's dotted, and make it full, it should fixate to the left when we scale it. So you see it doesn't move at this point, which is great. I'll bring my guides back so I have a reference to lock onto. And for each of these, we can do the same thing. So I'm gonna basically start again and grab the text, deselect these, and make sure that it's left affixed. And then we'll rename this one to card number just so we can have an understanding there. And now that one works. And one more time, we'll do it with this one. And actually I select the wrong thing there. We'll actually want to do this, deselect these and fix it left. And rename this to, let's see, expiration. And I'll scale that back. And I actually want this to say expiration, of course, too. So expiration. I'll hide my guides for now. It's command semicolon to do that. And inside this field, I actually want to have a placeholder, is what it's called on the web. And you can just have text that once you type will go away, but it's there to help you otherwise. So I'll type mm/YY, and that's just abbreviations for month and year. And our text right now is white, so we don't want that. And it's actually outside of our constraints group, so you can't even see it. So we want to bring it up inside that. Let's make it just a gray. We can just kind of use one of our colors we've used before, DDD. So if you find yourself using a ton of colors all the time, it's probably a good use case to add to your color palette. Right now I have that color saved and it's in my current foreground color. If I just click this icon, I could save it down and it's all square, and I could save that as a document palette like I have. So anytime I want to reuse this, I can export it or just open this file and it's all ready to go. That's actually quite light, to be honest. So I might even redo that one to maybe 7s across. And it's 6. And that's actually dark now. So let's trial and error, try 9. There we go. I like that. So I'll add that one, in fact. And this DDD we did use elsewhere for the stroke color, so that's something I can still save. You can edit the fill, you can rename it whatever you want to. So if you were wanting to do that, feel free. I like to just keep them named for the colors they are. If I were really fancy here, I'd probably put the hex code color as opposed to the RGB color. It's just one of those things that's a preference. So going forward, I can demonstrate by example the styles real quick. Just if I were to draw a new shape and match what we have over here, if I remember that one we saved, I could just go ahead and create that. And it doesn't maintain the border radius kind of styles, but it does the aesthetic styles it does have. So you'd still have to go in and make that like they were before in this case. So we'd have a height of 40, everything else would be about the same there. So that's kind of how that works. So that's something to keep in mind. It doesn't just maintain the exact proportions and width and height and stuff like that, but more or less the aesthetic qualities. The easiest thing to do really though is just duplicate a previous group or layer and go from there. So I'll just go do that going forward. We have the credit card CVC code and the postal code and the province and state next. So I'll add those fields. You see those guides there start to say like 28 point something. I don't really want them to be point. A trick I do, I'm not saying it's perfect. Basically nudge your object up to the previous one, hold shift, and then hit the down arrow like twice, and you'll see it nudge by that distance we set in the preferences before. So instead of being just kind of a varied amount of movement, you can actually control that in proportion. We moved it 36 pixels down. So now everything's fairly accurate. So if you were to translate this to code later, those measurements would be something you can actually transition and make it look just like the design, which is crucial these days. Okay, so let's do the CVC. This one's going to be a shorter field, so we'll just shrink this down to about that size. Let's triple click into here, call it CVC, and we could make it maybe a little bigger. And I'll option shift click on this field just to drag it further, and we could do the same thing from the left too. So if you nudge it up to the left to that one, hold shift and hit the right arrow key about 3 times maybe. I should probably do the same to this one. 1, 2, 3, maybe 4. Okay, and then I'll probably increase the size of that one. And And one thing I forgot to do in the constraints group is the placeholder. So you'll notice this is skewing a bit when we were shifting it. So I want to actually go back into constraints, uncheck these, and do the same thing like we did with the label. So now anytime I reposition this one, that will stay fluid. Last but not least is the state province, and this is going to be a drop down. So it's basically a select field in HTML terms if you're come from the code background. If not, it's perfectly fine. It's helpful to know some code, I would say, as a designer for the web, but it's not crucial. There's a huge argument around the design space of if designers should be able to code, and to each his own is what I would say. But you know, from a person who can do both, I would say it's certainly helpful. All right, so let's call this one state, and the other one was postal. Give it a set width, and then we'll come back over, align it left to the other one, and then do the shift nudge routine again. And then you can just from the right resize this so it's proportioned. So we've got 36 pixels in between all of these, or 32, excuse me. So see how balanced that looks when you have things in perfect proportion in the terms of pixels. It's great. On the state dropdown, we do want to have, and it's actually called province too, for those not in the states. We do want to have a placeholder on that one too, so I'm actually going to steal from this one and come back to this group and paste it in. It's going to paste up in the other group, but we can drag it down and it should find its way for us. It's going to have the same constraint, so when you copy and paste it, you're going to see the same thing, so that's really helpful. But we want it to say something else. Let's just say select one, something like that. And aside from that, we do need an arrow to kind of indicate that this is a dropdown. At least that's very helpful in terms of user experience. So I have another app open called Nucleo that I like to use, and by default it comes with Google Material Icons. We will use one from a library I like called Symbolicons. Unfortunately, I can't include that because it's not my rights to do so, but you can find something maybe in Material Icons to use since they're open source and free to use. So Chevron is what I'm going for right now, and I want to have this, just one of these, maybe at 24 pixels, and we can just drag it into Designer and it will open in a new document. But that's kind of what we want because we want to be able to edit this icon. If you were to just drop it right into your document, you'd notice it was an embedded document, and while you can work with it, it's harder to customize, so it's something to take into account. So if you open it independently, it may be a little more work, but it's worth it. And the 24 pixels is about the right size, so if you happen to drag that size in, then it's going to be easier on you. So let's just say Chevron down. And let's go to our color scheme and maybe use one of our swatches. Maybe just that gray color is enough. So that looks good. Let's make this a constraint too. So inside of this, it doesn't have any at the moment. Have that selected and command click the rounded rectangle in this group. And I want to align these things vertically from the middle. So if you hit that key, the align middle icon there in the contextual menu, you can actually make that really easy on yourself, and things just shift programmatically to have that balanced. So with that done, I want to constrain this to the right side of this group. So I'm going to deselect those arrows again, but this time it'll be on the right. So anytime we scale this, placeholder text will stay left. Same with the label, the arrow icon will stay to the right. So you see how awesome that is. Love it. So next we need our button, and it's going to be a pretty simple button. I do have a gradient made for it, so I'll just use a square to start with, and no specific height or width here, but something kind of larger and a little more vibrant is the key. I would set perfect pixels if you can though, so like 72 or so and 320 perhaps. And then you can align it down 32 pixels again, or even further. And I do want to set I don't want a stroke on this, So I'm going to turn that off. I also want the swatch to be this gradient here. This is kind of a red to orange gradient, and the darker orange is on the bottom left and the lighter orange is on the top right. I do want a radius on the corners, so let's give it about, let's say 6 pixels. And then inside this, I want to type just subscribe now. And it's going to be set in our original text that we chose, which was Helvetica. Definitely increase the size here and change the color to white, which is here. And we used a font, or a link to it. It's called Montserrat, I think. I'm sure I'm butchering that. And then we'll use kind of a bolder weight, so say extra bold, and like 20 points. You can use the smart guides to align this as you see fit. And then finally, we need to add an icon there. And like I said before, I referenced one called, it was in Symbolicons, but it was called Trophy. And I'll do the same thing where we just drag this to Designer, open it, and we can manipulate it from there. I'll just hit Command C to copy it, go back over to our doc, paste it in, and we'll just left align it to that text and make it white. Great. So I do want this to be constrained too. So I'll group those things, and for each bit, I want the icon to, I actually want to group these two things within that group, and you'll see why. So that group, I don't want it to scale. I do want it to stay centered when the button resizes though. So at this point, everything should be set to work the way I want. So you see it just stays fixed to the middle, which is perfect. Because when we get to the phone, we actually want that button to grow in size. But we can also do scaling in this direction too, and you notice it stays centered, which is great. So I'm gonna make the height maybe 60 pixels instead. Okay, we're looking good. I'm gonna group all of these things at this point. And we'll call that form. And we can group this stuff too. And let's position this centered based on our smart guides and the guides we created. And one last thing I forgot is that we need a close icon, because typically when this thing pops up, you don't necessarily want it to, you know, impede on the user. You want to give them an option to not subscribe. That would be smart. So we'll go one more step and add that close icon. This is going to be in material icons, and you could just type close if you're using this app. I'll grab, say, this size, 36 pixels, and we want to drag it into Designer. Copy that, move back over to our design, paste it in. We'll put it at the top right corner in our rounded rectangle here, and let's make it just a lighter color. Swatches panel, we could probably grab this color, and that should work. We can even probably tone the opacity down to like 75% or so. Awesome. Okay, the next step would be to group all these things, and we can even constrain this entire UI at this point. So let's just call this pop-up. And the main thing I want to constrain is this arrow or close icon. We want to not let it scale, but we do want to fix it to the top right. This will stay fixed to the left, and it can scale, but we only want it to scale to the left and right, not to the top. So we'll leave it as is like that. And then this one, we can scale it. Let's see if I want to do that. Yeah, we can try it. Let's see how that works at this point. Yeah, so you see everything scaling. The image inside this is not doing its job though. So we actually want this to not scale as well. So let's try that once more. Yeah, so now that image just kind of moves along that cropping. This isn't fail-safe, like I said, but it is kind of useful in the sense that you need to transfer it to other mock-ups or designs. Say you're designing for a tablet even, that's another use case, another width that you have to consider. So that's a kind of concept that you'll need to deal with. While we're at it, we can add some more of that embellishments to the background just to kind of give this a little more wow effect. So basically what I did is just place this image again back here, cut down the opacity, and you can hit Command bracket to send it to the back. Bring the opacity way down just to give some different effect to it. Almost don't want to be able to make out what it actually is. Add some shadow to this bit and see how we can go about working with it. I'm going to set the angle to 0, scale the radius up quite a bit, and the offset you can vary however you want to do it. And the color, you don't necessarily have to use black. Maybe even that shade of blue, kind of a deeper tone of that blue would work. It gives a little more blend as opposed to just a flat black color. And even add a little noise if you want to. Okay, great. So the next step is to go to the mobile view, and we'll go quickly iterate on that. And this is where I'd say it's going back to that element of the constraints isn't error proof. Obviously if you get down to the mobile size, things aren't going to look good, but we can kind of ebb and flow as we get to there and adjust things as we want. So when you think of a mobile design, you still want to give the user enough room to breathe, so to speak. So they need a way to interact with the UI and do what they do basically from a desktop site that they would do from there. So at this point, I'll probably ungroup this for now and we'll redo it later. What I want to focus on is getting our guide set up. So I'll probably just drag a couple into view that far in, and then one from this side. We want a bit of space on each side of this modal for the user just to realize that it is an extra layer. So our text of course needs to be smaller at this point, and I would go down to say 30, and you could just shrink this text box down. You'll notice the line height, or leading in this case, is a bit tall, so we need to adjust that too. We have our caricature palette down here. I'm going to adjust that size to be about 30 points. And we'll also center the text on mobile because that makes more sense, I think. We could just use this here. There we go. And I did position this in the first design, the original design. We have it actually overlaying the photo to save on space because there's a lot going on in such a small amount of screen real estate, so you have to take that into account. So I'm going to go ahead and stretch this all the way down, bring the button down. I'll probably ungroup these groups for now. So you'll see that the form also needs to collapse. The name field can be one long line. We'd probably keep it as is, and it looks pretty good. What we want to do though is add the fields that take up 2 columns on the desktop. We want to make those all one long width. So I'm actually going to break them down and just put each one after the other in their own separate rows. Maybe besides the CVC and zip code. So these could probably stay as is, and I'll probably just make them from the center. We have the button that can go right about there. The button's pretty wide. We'll probably bring it back down to about the width of the form just so it's consistent. And then this can come up. And what we can do is bring that photo back over. Could probably just grab it from this image, copy it with Command C, come over to this one, paste it in. It's going to be huge. That's okay. But we can scale it down, and I will just crop it to the main container, I think. So we didn't do that in the desktop view, but this one it makes sense since we're not going to really focus on that big shadow behind the scenes. So we have the main pop-up in this view, and we want that photo to crop to it. So what I'll do is drag it just beneath that, and it should put itself beneath it and nest it, as you can see there. And we do have it in the background as well, so that's kind of another thing to consider. Since that photo is now a background image, we actually want to make the text a little more prominent. So to do that, I'll actually make that white, and I'll even go as far as making that photo a little smaller. And you want to shrink from the corner to make it consistent there. And then we'll also add a effect on the photo to have a color overlay, so it's just slightly dark enough for that text to basically peek through and be legible. And you can go one step further and add effect to the text that is a shadow, and we'll do like say 270 or so. So you want to be able to definitely read what you see. Okay, so our final design is ready. We have our desktop version here on the left and our iPhone version on the right. With most web design, there's so many different devices to account for that it's virtually impossible to have a design for each. When it comes to coding, something like this involves making educated guesses. So you have to kind of consider a fixed width or guesses at widths that most devices will accommodate. So the idea here is to just at least support the main ones that a lot of people use. An iPhone is a pretty popular phone. A lot of people end up using it. So a lot of designers will focus most designs on it and the experience on that. So this is kind of an exercise just to show how to get to that point, but also use some of the cool features of Affinity Designer in terms of constraints or styles and color palettes and all those things that you can use to really scale a design. You can make virtually endless artboards in a design if you wanted to accommodate each design of your app or website. But this is just a concept just to show what you can do, a component you can make, and what possibilities exist. So hopefully you enjoyed this. There'll probably be more videos like this where we just study patterns in the web and design those things based on inspiration or based on a problem, trying to solve a problem. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions or feedback, there are comments in the section below the video, so feel free to leave those. As always, if you're a pro subscriber, you can download these assets and get into the layers and all of the things that I've shown you here and have these art files to work with alongside your own if you're following along. So thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.